Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar today, part of Enterprise's Rural Preservation Academy and our national preservation-focused efforts. I'm Jenny Rogers, Vice President, Denver Market Leader, and leader of the Rural and Native American Programs team at Enterprise Community Partners. I'm honored to lead a fantastic, dedicated team of mission-driven enterprisers working in rural and tribal communities across the country. Enterprise is a national nonprofit affordable housing organization that works coast to coast and is focused on three organizational priorities: to increase housing supply, advance racial equity, and build resilience and upward mobility. No other organization in the country addresses America's housing crisis from every angle. We create and preserve affordable homes. We own and operate rental homes and provide resident services for more than 22,000 people. We advocate for policy and best practices that drive system changes. We operate on a national scale alongside thousands of local partners with an on-the-ground presence in urban and rural communities across the country. Today's session is going to focus on rental housing preservation in America's rural communities. As you probably know, much of the affordable housing stock in rural communities is at risk of being lost to the open market or disrepair. 1/4 of rural communities in the US have seen significant increases in the number of households that spend at least half their income on housing. COVID has exacerbated these housing needs. Today, we're honored to be joined by an amazing set of speakers who will discuss rural rental preservation, challenges faced by those dedicated to rural preservation, and opportunities at hand to keep this key housing stock affordable into the future. Thank you to our speakers and to the more than 480 registrants listening today. Before we dig into our agenda, I'd like to start our session with a land acknowledgement from my home in Denver, Colorado. I honor and acknowledge that I live and work on land stolen from the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations, a place that was home to over 48 tribes during the past 11,000 years. This land was an important site for many Native nations who were forcefully removed through violent and disrespectful acts. I appreciate these nations as the original stewards of this land, water, plants, and animals, and pay my respect and give thanks to the indigenous peoples still connected to this place. Native Americans have contributed so much to the fabric of our nation and this state. I ask that we let this acknowledgement serve as an opening for greater awareness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, and as a step towards a more equitable relationship and reconciliation with our Indigenous communities. Please take a moment to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, and settlement so that we may embrace a new sense of connection, relation, and belonging to each other and to the spaces that we occupy. Thank you. Today, we're really excited to be joined by Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, who's introduced the DASH Act in the Senate, which, if passed, will increase funding for many key affordable housing programs, including critical funding for rural housing programs. Senator Wyden was unable to join us, unfortunately, in person today, but he's pre-recorded a message for participants of today's webinar. Thank you all for joining. And now we'll hear from Senator Wyden.
While I couldn't be with all of you in person, I so appreciate the opportunity to say a few words about the importance of preserving rural housing. And I'm glad to be able to lend you Madison Moskowitz to talk in detail about the DASH Act. But you can't keep her because we got a lot of work to do in this hugely important arena. First, a big kudos to Enterprise Community Partners. Your work is really the gold standard for addressing our nation's crisis of housing affordability, and especially in rural communities. I recently introduced the DASH Act, decent, affordable, safe housing for all, to ensure that every single Oregonian has a roof over their head and a floor under their feet. As we've said, with respect to the DASH Act, housing is a basic human right. That's why right now I'm working around the clock to ensure that included in the Build Back Better agenda are expanded vouchers for homeless kids and families and increased investment in supportive services and housing supply. I'm also very pleased to be able to support Enterprise Community Partners' efforts to increase investment in affordable and accessible rural housing. Big thanks, everybody, for having me, and all the best for a successful event.
So a big thanks to you, Senator Wyden, and to Madison, from whom we'll get a chance to hear more later during our panel. As we get started, I also want to acknowledge our funding partners who have made the Pacific Northwest Rural Winter Preservation Academy and this broader conversation today possible. And to introduce myself, I am Robin Wolf, the Senior Program Director of Rural Housing at Enterprise Community Partners. We'll want to thank Oregon Housing and Community Services, the Collins Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and Fannie Mae, all of who have supported this important work for the entire year, and we are thankful for their support. So with that, I'm excited to get into the meat of the conversation and to introduce you to our first speaker today, Lance George. Lance is the Director of Research and Information at Housing Assistance Council, where he leads the organization's research, data, and policy efforts. Lance works at the intersection of housing research and data to help Americans who have quality and safe homes understand and care about those who do not. Lance is the author of the Rental Housing for 21st Century Rural America, a platform for preservation, which has really helped those of us who are interested in affordable housing in rural communities understand and crystallize the challenges that are being presented and the opportunities that exist as we work to ensure long-term affordable housing in rural America. Lance describes himself as a displaced Kentuckian who currently splits his time between Washington, D.C. and Minnesota, and he embodies the adage, Northern charm and Southern efficiency. And so with that introduction, Lance, I will turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Robin. And we really like to thank Enterprise for including the Housing Assistance Council in this important discussion. As many of you know, the Housing Assistance Council, or more commonly referred to as HAC, is a national nonprofit that supports affordable housing efforts in rural areas of the United States. And this particular issue, I would venture to say, is among our top 3 priorities. First of which is probably how COVID is impacting or will likely in the future impact the rural housing provision and markets. The second is affordability, which is also a major concern. It's probably the largest housing concern in rural communities, but it often goes unnoticed. And then secondly, or thirdly, I would say this particular issue on the preservation or preserving affordable rental housing in rural communities. And they really all 3 cross-pollinate. So I think it's timely. We appreciate Enterprise for holding this discussion. I might ask Adrian to advance the slide to the next slide. So characteristically, I will bombard you with statistics and numbers and graphs and charts and maps. But I'm going to start out with an anecdote, which is a very anti-research thing to do, and just say that in our perspective, USDA Section 515 multifamily rental housing is one of the most important resources in the rural rental housing stock. And in some aspects, it's in many communities, it's the only affordable rental housing. Again, that's an anecdote, but I think that would be confirmed by many people who work in this space and who are experts in this area, but also work in rural communities or work with this program. In many respects, it is among the highest quality because it is a federally assisted type of form of housing. It meets a federal standard. And then on the inverse, there's just a dearth of good quality rental housing in many rural communities. And that's due to some market and spatial dynamics. So it's a really important resource. And I want to just reiterate before we jump into some of the statistics, why it's important. So maybe I could ask Adrian to just advance the slide, the next slide, and note just how important it is across the nation. So 87% of all U.S. counties have at least one USDA Section 515 multifamily property. And Adrian, if you could advance the next slide. This is just a geographic distribution to illustrate that point. There are more than 12,000 properties, and you'll see they have a broad reach across the United States and rural America. While they do have a broad reach, that it is really important, there are larger concentrations of these properties in the Midwest and the southeastern United States. In fact, about 2/3 of all properties are located in the Midwest or the Southeast. There are more properties in the Midwest, but they tend to be smaller. So the unit counts are somewhat the same. The South and the Midwest have similar unit counts. But Again, just to reiterate the geographic importance, and I'd say the substantive importance, there are many other federally assisted rental properties that don't have this volume of stock. So it's also substantively important to the affordable housing supply in this nation. Next slide, please, Adrian. USDA's multi-rental housing programs also serve some of the more vulnerable residents in the United States. And just to illustrate that, the average income of USDA Section 515 residents is just a little more than $13,000 a year. And the next slide, Adrian. And those households that receive rental assistance in these properties, it's even lower at about $11,380 a year. So those are the average incomes. And then 2/3 of all residents, approximately 2/3, this varies from year to year, but it's very close to this. 2/3 of all residents are either elderly or disabled. So in many respects, the tenants are extremely important because of the lack of supply. And then secondly, if they had to move to another property or another resource, many of them would be very limited. It would be very difficult given some of the economic and just the age and disability constraints. So next slide, please. And then I want to make one final point on why this is important. I think it's really important for a lot of reasons. We can go into more depth and detail. We noticed the geographic dispersion, but 90% of all persistent poverty counties, and I think many of you are familiar with what persistently poor communities are that have multiple decades of above 20% or more poverty. 90% of all those communities have at least one Section 515 rental housing. And this is credit to USDA. Early in the development of this program, there weren't as many of these properties in persistently poor communities, but through priorities and later in the program stage, there were greater development of multifamily properties in these communities, which are much more economically distressed and vulnerable. So just those are a few quick data points on why this is really important. I know we have a range of expertise in this area, but I don't think you could restate these enough, candidly. So Robin, Adrian, if you could advance to the next slide. So I think this is why many people want to hear the kind of meat of our discussion is what are the data telling us? This is a feeble attempt at some bad analogy or some symbolism, but I purposefully blurred the photo behind this on this slide because some of the data are not as quite clear as we would like. Many of the data that we try to make estimates on the status of the USDA Section 515 properties, they're primarily administrative or business records and not initially intended for empirical analysis. And they can be complicated and challenging. We are somewhat confident in the data that we're presenting today. We've done a lot of work, but there are still some limitations and some caveats and asterisks. There are always going to be those in any data analysis, and we'll try to let you know about some of the caveats and some of the asterisks. But sometimes these data can be challenging. So I don't know if we have the exact precise figure, but we think we're relatively close. And in many respects, the trends are more important than the exact absolute numbers. If you could, the next slide, please, Adrian. So as Robin noted, HAC produced a report in 2017 entitled A Platform for Preservation, where we took a deep dive looking at this stock and what its future may look like, particularly around the issue of maturing mortgages and exiting properties and loss of stock. And with this, I often refer to, there were a lot of charts and graphs in that report as well. If there was one illustration that we could present, it would be this one. It's simply a bar chart or a histogram of the estimate, and that is the operative word, but to be very clear, the estimate of properties, USDA Section 515 properties, that would exit the portfolio over the next 40 or 50 years. And it started in 2016. So the blue bars indicate the number of properties that would exit, and the orange commensurate line are the number of units that would exit. And we are currently in the phase, what we would call the build-up phase, where there are estimated less than 100 properties per year that would exit the portfolio until about 2026 or 2027 when it dramatically expands. So what happened? And I think that's where we'll try to give you some indication of what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years. We're in the middle of this build-up phase to kind of set the stage today for the other discussion. But if you could advance the slide, Adrian. So according to HAC's estimates, we estimate that roughly 1,000 properties left USDA's portfolio between 2016 and 2021. And the next slide, just to illustrate in units, because I think that's really important, the difference between units and properties. Roughly 24,000 properties exited the portfolio in that same time period. Now, advance to the next slide, Adrian, please. This is, I don't want to confuse the issue, but this is the absolute number of properties in the portfolio over the last 5 years. So you'll see in 2016, there were roughly 13,000 or 13,800 properties. And you'll see the decline. This is the absolute number of properties in the portfolio per year. What I think might be challenging, and this is where we had a data challenge based on some prior assumptions, is the trend is going down. And in 2019 and 2020, you'll see increases, not really increases, but the number of properties increased from the 2018 level. And I think there are some caveats and some nuance there, candidly, to explain that. There was an assumption that there is no more new development of these properties, so how could you have an increase? And I think it's a combination of two factors. This is our speculation. We would ask USDA to weigh in on this as well. That USDA loan servicing, we're incorporating some loan servicing techniques to extend the maturity dates of these properties. So that included some of them. Basically, there were some reamortizations of some loans. And then secondly, there have been in the past few years, for many years, there were no new units produced under this program. But as of the last few years, there have been a relatively small number of units produced, new units developed under the Section 515 loan program. And that's going to change this dynamic as well. So you'll see, I don't think this is as important to the year to year, but we did want to include that. So Adrian, if you could advance to the next slide. And this is just the inverse. This is another way to look at this. This is just the net change in ratio to those estimates that we placed before. So you'll see the orange line on this chart indicates the estimate, the estimate of the number of properties that would leave the portfolio based on that 2016 analysis. And these are primarily due to mortgage maturity. And the blue bar indicates the number of properties that actually left. So you'll see there were, they exceeded the estimate in 2016 and 2017, the number of properties that left, but it's actually below the estimate in 2018 and 2019, which is relevant to the issue that I just mentioned before, that there were less departures due to some dynamics. And then you'll see it's increased where there's a minor increase in 2020 where there were more properties that left than were estimated. So that's two ways of looking at it. It can be confusing. I would say I would not worry as much about the year to year. The net total over the past 5 years from HAC's estimates is that roughly 1,000 properties left the portfolio, constituting 24,000 units. And I don't want to go into too much detail. This is one of the small caveats. If you look at the data, it's actually going to indicate that more properties left, roughly 1,087. But we believe that about 84 or 85 of those properties didn't actually leave the portfolio. They were they were moved around in a process consolidation where the loan of one property was consolidated into another. So in some respects, it looks like they left, but they actually didn't. That can get really complicated and nuanced, but our estimate is roughly 1,000 properties left. So if you could advance to the next slide, Adrian. And this is just a geographic presentation of the properties that left, the estimated properties that left between 2016 and 2021. You'll notice, and these are the 1,000 properties, you'll notice a larger concentration in the Midwestern United States, in the upper Midwest. And this is really relevant to when many of those loans were made. Some of the earliest loans in the portfolio were made in the upper Midwest, notably Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin. And that's where you see some of the larger concentrations of loss in the properties. So this is not surprising and also there's a larger number of properties in those areas. This is not necessarily surprising, and this kind of mirrors what we projected geographically in our 2016 report, where this would happen. And we did see hot spots in this particular area, but you can see the map where you see a larger concentration again in the Midwest and some in the South. So if you could advance, Adrian, to the next slide. And this is another way to look at that by state. And these are the number of properties that exited over that time period by state. And you'll see, again, in the Midwest, states like Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, South Dakota, Texas has a lot of units. Those all had more than 60 properties left between 2016 and 2021. And then Adrian, we're going to look just next at the number of units. You'll notice there's a difference because some of the units, the properties in the Midwest have fewer number of units. But again, states like Michigan, Texas, Puerto Rico, Minnesota, Indiana, and Wisconsin all lost more than 1,000 units in that time period. And then if you could advance to the next slide, Adrian. Yeah, just a couple of other characteristics that we have and we want to display. The what type of properties left? So predominantly over that time period, family properties. There are a subset of properties in the USDA portfolio that are restricted to age 62 and older, and only about a quarter of those properties left. So the predominant number of properties left that were what we would classify as family properties, but they also make up the bulk of the portfolio as well. And the next slide, Adrian, I think this is one of the last slides, which looks at the change in tenant race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity is a really important dynamic to housing characteristics and demand and issue. And this is, I think, is also just a really good presentation of what race and ethnicity looks like in this portfolio. But you'll notice that some of the larger losses in units were among white, not Hispanic households, and that's not that surprising, given that a large number of the properties that exited were in the upper Midwest, which tend to be racially and ethnically more homogeneous than the nation as a whole. But as I noted, I find this chart interesting just to look at the overall racial composition of the portfolio, where Black non-Hispanic households are the second most prevalent racial group in these properties, and Hispanic Latinos are the third most prevalent. And that really, the new census data just came out. The HAC did some analysis on the new 2020 census data. And, you know, Latinx and Hispanic residents have surpassed rural Blacks or African Americans as the second most prevalent racial or ethnic group in rural communities. So you'll still see some of those dynamics where that are important, but not a lot of change among non-white residents in the portfolio over those years. You see larger changes among white, not Hispanic households. So I would make one more point where I think we wish we could present data that would be of interest to the Housing Assistance Council. And I think this discussion and strategies moving forward is we don't have the data on this, but what is the disposition of those properties that left? So there are really 3 or 4 ways that a property can exit the portfolio. One of which is that the mortgage matures. It's simply the mortgage has been fulfilled. The second is for a limited number of owners, they can prepay the loan if the loan were made before a certain date and meets certain criteria. There's also units that were in distress and foreclosure, and then kind of an other category. And we don't really have that. We weren't even really able to ascertain that in the 2017 report. But we think we would really like, and we would encourage USDA to provide more transparency on that provision of how the stock changed. How are the units being lost? Are they being mortgages maturing or prepayments, things of that nature? So if you could advance to the next slide, Adrian, please. So we did just in ending, wanted to present a few resources that we have. And if you could advance to the next slide, Adrian. Thank you so much for all of this. Generally, you can go to www.ruralhome.org, which is our website to garner some general information. I'm also referenced the 2017 report. While it's 5 years old, there's, I think, still a lot of relevant and viable information in that report. It's quite a comprehensive review of the portfolio and this issue. So I think that's still relevant. Also, HAC produces monthly reports on the status of USDA housing obligations and the history of those programs. We produce those monthly. We've been doing that since 1996, so you can see that link as well. And if I could make one closing remark, I would say I would go back to, I should have inserted this as the last slide, but I would go back to that initial chart that we had that estimated maturing mortgages over the next 45 or 50 years, and note that we are still in this, what we would call the buildup phase, right? Where there are I wouldn't say it's manageable. I mean, losing 24,000 units of the stock is never optimal, but we are still at a point where I think we have some time. We have 5 or 6 more years to try to figure this out. And I would really focus on that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, HAC produces this information and analysis to help inform strategies and solutions. I've often said I'm big on problems and short on solutions. So that's why I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion, where all the solutions will be presented to this problem, but or to this issue. But thank you very much, and we look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Robin.
Yes, thank you, Lance. I really appreciate you and this data and the platform for preservation as a resource has really been helpful as we've thought about how we structure even the rural preservation academies and sort of our body of work. There are a couple of questions, Lance, that some folks have that maybe you could help us answer. First one that came through is, and you hit on this a little bit, but how many of the properties that have been lost over the past 5 years have been lost to foreclosure?
And I think I alluded to that. I wish we have some, not a very technical research team, we have some inkling, but we are not confident enough to place those data publicly at this point. We just need more transparency, and we need to do more analysis, but I think we need more information. And candidly, we have some conflicting, we just have some challenges discerning some of the data that we have. So we can't viably answer that or answer that question right now. So unfortunately, we can't. We were really looking forward to it, but we can't.
That makes perfect sense. There are some questions for clarification, and I think that maybe you and I can help with some of the clarification. One question early on in the chat asks, how are we defining rural communities? So I'll let you take a stab at that, Lance, and then we can ask Dan how USDA further defines it as needed.
Thank you. Yeah. At first, I would say thank you. You know, the USDA Section 515 program can be a little nuanced. The question of how you define rural is almost a daily question that we get, and I don't know if it'll ever be resolved for these particular purposes. I would say it uses the USDA's eligibility, the eligibility for multi and single family programs at the USDA Rural Development Agency, which is I won't go into a lot of detail, but in many respects is probably the most liberal or extensive definition of rural areas that there is available. It includes a lot of territory that many other definitions would not consider rural or small town. So, but all of the analyses here that we use, and I don't think we referred to rural as much, but all of the analyses would include properties that are within, most of them. There are some properties that have been graduated out. They are now not in eligible areas, but they're grandfathered in because it's still a viable loan. But all of the analyses would include would basically fall under USDA's multi and single family eligibility.
Right, and there is a map that you can kind of cross-reference for that as well. This has been an ongoing discussion as we talk about rural communities. States and state resources might define rural communities different. So even if you have a 515 property, it might not be eligible for funding from a different source as related to rural. And this is something that comes up for those of us who work on rural issues nationally quite a bit, is how is rural being defined? So I think I'm interested to hear how others are seeing that as we go to the next speaker. So we will move on, and if we weren't able to get to your questions right now, we will have a panel and hopefully be able to hit on some of these questions as we continue to move on into this conversation. So at this point, I would like to introduce Dan Rogers. Dan Rogers is the Director of Production and Preservation at USDA Rural Development. Dan brings over 20 years of mission-based experience to that role, and he has worked in local, state, and federal government, honing a deep skill set in the full spectrum of affordable housing finance and oversight. Dan's bio states that he is never deterred by a challenge and has used his skills to execute on the thorniest of deals with layered capital stacks, complex ownership structures, and extensive rehab needs. Given the challenges facing the USDA rural portfolio and the cost of housing, I think that his new position will require him to put those skills to the test. So with that, Dan, I'm going to turn the mic over to you and give us a presentation on what's happening right now with USDA RD as it relates to rural housing preservation.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate that. I didn't write that bio. Those words that you used to describe my experience are way too big for me. But thank you for that, and thank you, Lance, too. That was really interesting data. I'm going to get into some data a little bit later on, and it was really refreshing and reassuring thought that our data, I think you're going to see, agrees with yours. And it really does highlight the importance of the partnerships that need to exist, especially between USDA, Enterprise, HAC, to make sure that we're using this data that's available to us to try to, prioritize and come up with a sound preservation strategy. I'm going to talk a little bit about. We can just start the slide presentation here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the transition into the new model, go over the preservation strategy for the 515 portfolio, which is something that we're actively working on, talk a little bit about the NPR pipeline, go through some of our funding opportunities, and then talk about some pretty important priorities for USDA and production and preservation that are directly related to the implementation of our preservation strategy. Some quick hits and some data summaries. But next slide. The first thing I want to talk about is our realignment model. So I think most folks know this, but if you don't, and very recently, we have adopted a new national lending platform. So very similar to the folks who operate within the HUD world. Multifamily went through at USDA went through a realignment, and what we did was we went from this sort of 47 state office configuration with very different interpretations, guidance on policy, into one consistent national platform. So to sort of align strategies and policies. Right now, the production and preservation division resembles more of an affordable housing lending platform. We have a processing and report review branch, that's application intake, an underwriting branches, and a closing branch, and we're supported by what we call a program support branch, but it's mostly policy and technical assistance. This has been a bit of a heavy lift for us. I think folks certainly are seeing it and feeling it. It was really necessary, like I said, to implement the consistency. But what accompanied that was our office identifying certain transactions, all in various states of application, and sort of rescuing them and resuscitating them and bringing them back to life. That's been a challenge for us. There are about 500 tasks right now that are in our pipeline. Some of those are strictly related to lending applications. Others are related to lighter lift tasks like construction monitoring and payment processing, but all fall in the responsibility of this new aligned model. We're working really hard to make sure that we're delivering on customer service and getting those brought back online. But obviously, please be patient with us while we do that. Next slide. So one of the biggest things that we're working on is this preservation strategy for the 515 portfolio. What we're doing in production and preservation is focusing on enhanced collaboration with the other two offices in the multifamily office, the Division of Asset Management and Field Operations. We're looking at other things beyond forecasting mortgage maturity, right, and expiration of affordability. We're looking at the other things that drive some of these assets with these expiring mortgages to come in earlier, mostly based on physical condition, some other attributes that relate to tenant needs, property needs, market needs, and we're trying to identify what those budgetary needs are. And we think we have a pretty good handle on it. I'm going to go into that in the next slide, but we think we have a pretty good handle on what it is that we're going to need and how to approach that. We're factoring a risk-ranked approach. The entire existing portfolio has been risk-ranked by the Asset Management Division, taking into account some of the things I mentioned earlier: physical attributes, management and occupancy, effectiveness of management, ownership, market demand, all of those things. And that's going to factor into how we prioritize assets for preservation as well. And then the big one here, continuing to advocate to decouple the rental assistance from the 515 financing. So I think most folks are aware that under current program requirements, that 515 mortgage needs to stay alive to keep that rental assistance alive. And so there are a number of tools, Lance mentioned them earlier, a number of ways that we can accomplish that with, debt deferrals and some restructuring. But our preference, and this is in some legislation that's out there, is to support the decoupling of that rental assistance. Very similar to how HUD was able to decouple its Section 8 contracts from associated financing platforms, preserve them, and use them instead to recapitalize, leverage private resources to recapitalize that. And then lastly, a preservation fund, which is something that we're using when we have properties that exit the portfolio but leave rental assistance behind, pooling those resources and reallocating them to properties that aren't fully assisted but could benefit from the rental assistance. Those are the major priorities that are part of the preservation strategy. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the one that's pretty similar to Lance's slide. Really concerning when you start to see some of the spikes that begin in 2030 for properties that are exiting the portfolio. We have it broken down by region. We are very clear that the existing NPR, which is our preservation pilot program, doesn't have the annual appropriations to address this. The ARP cash that is coming in, or that is proposed, if it is delivered, which will be somewhere around the $4.2 billion range, that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of products and instruments in that credit box. Same thing, debt deferral, soft second loans, we believe potentially mortgage write-downs. But even with all of that, we don't think that carries us beyond 2029. So this is just a start. There are going to be a lot more resources needed to recapitalize and preserve this 515 portfolio, and that really underlines the importance of decoupling this rental assistance and trying to leverage other capital resources to help us with this. Next slide. And one of those is, the continuation, as I mentioned, of the NPR program. So we have currently an NPR pipeline of 171 transactions. That anticipated need is about $300 million. These are folks that responded to the NPR and NOFA that was out there, that we were able to go through, evaluate, score, but don't have the funds to address. As we're able to address them, as funds become available, one of the best examples at the end of this, we had some 515 resources available, not new construction, but 515 resources available that we were able to allocate to this pipeline and address some of these properties. But until we get further support, it's going to be very difficult to address this pipeline. One of the things, though, that we're going to do is issue our no-cost debt deferral NOSA for NPR that has a target date of December 1st. But it's really critical that we continue to make folks aware of the importance of NPR and how it plays a critical role in the preservation strategy of the 515 portfolio. Next slide. So this is just a quick calendar of some of our available funding opportunities. These are all still on target. We have some farm labor housing rounds, but the preservation rounds and the technical assistance rounds, you can see listed there. This is something that's readily available from me. So and when this changes, we roll it out in industry platforms like these. So as of now, this is very dependable data. Next slide. And these are some of the things that we're doing to try to enhance the compatibility of our resources. So one of the things that we're doing in terms of stakeholder outreach is we're intensifying, frankly, our outreach to housing finance agencies and state agencies that allocate low-income housing tax credits. It's my understanding, I'm vaguely aware, I'm not greatly aware, but I'm vaguely aware that in the past, state offices had provided a list of assets that were priorities for preservation. It's not something that on a national platform we can do. What we can provide our allocating agencies is a list of attributes that we use to prioritize and risk rank our portfolio. And if they use that same risk ranking and those attributes, our preservation strategies should align. And we're also working closely with allocating agencies on expanding the model that some states have already put in place, which is including a set aside for RD-assisted assets, preservation set aside for those assets. The other thing that we're working on, and this is something that was, that I discovered as we went through our recent farm labor housing funding cycle, is that our current USDA's current NOFAs and NOSAs aren't really compatible with other public lending cycles. We have requirements in our NOSAs and NOFAs that required other funding sources to be in place. I know from my experience on the state level it's just not realistic for low-income housing tax credit allocating agencies, especially in very competitive markets, to be faced with the competitiveness that they have and the threshold test and the place in service deadlines that they have to make an award to a property that is waiting for us on funding. So not in the current round, but in the round that we anticipate in all future rounds, the 516 round that we anticipate in the end of the first quarter of calendar year FY22 will feature some of those modifications that make those application requirements for our resources softer and the commitments from USDA stronger. So when you receive an award from us, you can then take it and use it as something of substance when you're applying for your low-income housing tax credits. With that, though, there is going to be an expiration on those awards. But that's one of the difficulties here, and I think that perhaps a contributing factor to the decision that was made to structure it the way that we had structured it was there was some concern that our obligations were just sitting out there and prohibiting us from assisting assets that could be assisted, sitting out there waiting for those properties to get their tax credit award. And what we're doing instead is making commitments, putting an expiration on them, probably like one year, giving applicants sufficient time to take our commitment, bring it to a tax credit allocating agency, compete in a round, and if they're unsuccessful, we'll be able to rescind that commitment of funds and reallocate it to a property that's in a more ready state. So that's a big piece, and that's coming soon. But it's a critical part of making our funding opportunities more compatible with some of our state partners. And then continued stakeholder outreach, a lot of the things I was just talking about. Continue to advocate for new resources and better ways. Feedback from the industry, lenders, owners, TA providers on how we can deliver our programs more efficiently. Next slide. And then here are some quick hits. I'm just going to blast through them. So we're looking at a guaranteed fee reduction in the 538 program. We expect this to be rolled out in November, early December. This is a fee reduction across the board, but then deeper fee reductions for applications that feature anything that deals with energy efficiency and green components, preservation of existing housing and workforce housing, modifying the terms of our CNA. So historically, we've required a 20-year CNA. Something that more resembles the affordable housing industry standard is a 15-year term. It gives us a better picture of what the property's truer needs are and sort of avoids the situation of backloading a CNA and never really realizing what some of the improvements our property's needs are. And then the multifamily housing transfer tool, this has come up. This was based on very helpful industry feedback. That's an internal and external facing tool that is designed to give clear instructions to the industry and to USDA staff under this new realignment on how to process the variety of transfers and with whom the industry will be working with when they're going through their transfers, along with a consolidated list of resources that will help with the transfer process. Next slide. Administration's priorities and our NOSFAs and NOSAs, we're working on that. Those are priorities given to us from the administration that address some of the things that the administration is working on and prescribed how we give discretionary points for those priorities. Credit report fees, this is a big one, transferring the responsibilities of credit report procurement from multifamily housing during the application process to owners, making it much more resemble what an FHA application would be, or really any lending platform where an applicant provides the credit report instead of having to go through that administrative process that slows down the entire application of giving us funds, having us procure a credit report, getting it back, and then incorporating it into the review. It seems like a small thing, but it's actually a pretty substantial time saver in the processing business line we've discovered. Next slide. Enhanced internal communication. Again, this is something that we're doing, internally. More coordination between USDA's asset management, field operations division, and production and preservation. So there's less confusion from the industry when we're processing transactions. Just making sure that all three areas are fully aware of what the transaction is gives us an opportunity to ask and answer questions that we can answer internally and not hold up the processing timeline. Consolidated P2 pipeline. This is something that upon realignment we realized didn't exist. We have internal tracking spreadsheets, but nothing yet that I can use to identify when the industry calls, where a transaction is, who it's with, how long it's been there, and things like that. And then some other things: prepayment process improvements, third-party reports, and then standardized.
You got that other check? It just took.
Are all things that we're working on. We should be getting toward the end. Next slide. Yeah, and then just lastly, because this is our first full year in the realignment, we're going to use it along with the new pipeline that we're building, the pipeline tool that we're building to track just how long it takes us to complete some of these tasks, use that to forecast predictability, establish performance goals, and try to beat those goals. It's something that we're really committed to. The first step, though, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is clearing out this backlog, this realignment backlog, and sort of clearing the pipeline so we can get a really accurate picture of just how long it takes for someone to come in the door, go through our process, and go through all the review of third-party reports, underwriting, closing, all of the pain points that we deal in that business line, and try to just establish where we can eliminate those and turn these transactions around faster, so that properties that are waiting for preservation aren't incurring more costs while they're waiting on us. So these are all things that we are really excited to do. We need your help in doing it. Frankly, we continue to solicit for feedback from the industry. Absolutely contact me directly if you have any thoughts. Happy to hear it and happy to continue to engage in discussions on how we can improve how we can improve our program delivery. So that's all that I have. I'm sorry if I went over. Was I close, Robin?
No, you're fantastic, Dan.
Oh,
yeah,
no kidding.
we're actually right on time. So
That's the
thank
first
you
time
for
in my life
that.
I've ever done
Lots
that.
of
All right.
questions coming in via chat and via the Q&A feature. A couple, some are zooming in. So one is a question about, does USDA still require the full funding of replacement reserves for the term for the refinance? And so I think that's a real process-oriented question. And if you had a quick answer to that, Dan.
I don't have a quick answer to it. I would have to take a look at the specific details of the retail, frankly. So generally, I think it's thoughtful for us to have a reserve account that's capitalized, sufficiently, both through initial capitalization and ongoing monthly contributions that addresses the items that are identified in the IPCNA. Whether or not that's coterminous with the mortgage term, I'm not sure how that always aligns, but that would be my bigger concern, is that it ties more with the items that are identified in the needs assessment.
Great, and I understand where that question is coming from, Harold, and on a transactional level, often we have the transfer process is a little bit complicated. So could you explain how that transfer tool might help facilitate transfers, or how that could help us better understand these steps in that transfer process?
Yeah, and this is a big one, and thank you for that question. So we received a lot of feedback over the summer. So I don't know if folks are aware, but I took the position in May, and as we were sort of steaming toward the end of the fiscal year and racing against all these fiscal year oriented deadlines, we started to get a lot of questions from industry partners who had transfers in the pipeline that have some real serious tax implications at end of calendar year. And it became really obvious that there was a lot of confusion during the realignment process with folks who were charged with processing transfers. And so what that caused us to do was take a really close look at not only just the ordinary processing and how we envision it in the context of the realignment, but the different types of transfers. So clearly, transfers where we're dealing with, for estate planning and deceased borrowers is different than, a full-blown transfer or a two-step process that's part of a recapitalization. So it became really obvious to us that both the industry and staff internally didn't have the guidance that they needed to process that. So Stephanie Virgin, who's part of my P2 leadership team, and is one of our, she takes a leadership role in being a liaison between the USDA and housing finance agencies on leveraging capital resources, is taking the lead in creating this tool. It involves the other multifamily divisions, asset management and field operations servicing. And the goal here is to create this product, internal and external facing, and get it out there so there is a real clear pathway in all manners of transfers, and provides you with the resources and features like an FAQ function where even if your specific scenario isn't described or contemplated in the document, you might be able to find how it was handled if a similar transaction existed. So that's the goal. We think that that'll be really helpful, and also part of it is the pipeline tracking, not just financing instruments and applications, but transfers and construction monitoring. Construction request draws will be tracked in the pipeline, so that will also play a part in examining just the timing and who's working on these transfers. It allows me to see that and identify just how long it's been in a certain spot and why it's there and what we're waiting on, so we can clearly communicate to the industry what it is that we're waiting for in order to get this moving. So long answer, we expect to have it out in mid-November, and really looking forward to it. We really think it's going to be helpful. And we'll also be putting on a symposium, a listening session, I'm not sure what we're going to call it, workshop, where we roll this out to the industry and give folks an opportunity to go through it and ask questions about it. Really looking forward to it. It's going to be a very helpful tool.
Fantastic. We're looking forward to it as well. I think anything that helps us to understand and how to replicate the process as we transfer and take synergies off, out from one project to another would be really great. So one last thing, and then we'll transition to the panel. There are a couple of questions. I think they got spiked by the decoupling bullet and on one of your slides, the decoupling of the vouchers from the 515 projects themselves. As you alluded, the partnering of 521 with 515 is unique the way it is set up kind of within the portfolio, but some concerns just on the level of how does that impact projects that are in development or currently operating, if the underwriting has been done assuming that there'll be vouchers as part of that project.
Well, what we're talking about here is a preservation tool, and maybe I'm just not understanding that question, but properties that are that have mortgages that are maturing, instead of going through the mechanisms that we need to keep that 515 mortgage alive to preserve the rental assistance, getting the 515 off the books and repositioning that rental assistance away from a budget-based scenario and more toward like a market rent scenario. So really similar to, now let me be really clear about this. This is something that we want, that we're advocating for. It's not something that we yet have the authority to do, but it's out there in a couple forms of draft legislation. But what we're really looking for here is to do something that more closely resembles what HUD did with 202 PRAC RAD conversions, kind of a similar concept, right? Where that PRAC assistance, that budget-based rental assistance can be sort of decoupled from that 202 financing and used instead of having rents set on a budget-based format, have them set at a rent level market format that will then allow properties to leverage that additional net operating income to the capital debt that they need for recapitalization. That's the goal. So I'm not sure if I answered.
No, I think question, you did, and it's understood. I think the key is you're talking about as 515s are expiring, this could help you to not lose the 521 rental assistance. Precisely. That would happen exactly. So not you losing the physical units and the vouchers at the same time, which makes this such an acute problem as it exists right now, because you're losing not only the actual physical units but the vouchers in combination. So decoupling would help to mitigate some of that loss. Thank you for that. And we will now transition into introducing the panel. Dan, you stay on the panel. So Dan, you have already met, but the new members of our panel who will be joining right now are Madison Moskowitz. Madison is from Senator Ron Wyden's office and is a domestic economic and policy advisor. She has worked for the Senate Finance Committee chairman for 4 years, and she is a proud Oregonian. We are Oregon strong on this panel, seen as this conversation is an outgrowth of the Pacific Northwest Rural Preservation Academy. So very excited to have Madison participating on this panel. We also have Matt Traylor. Matt Traylor is the senior policy advisor covering housing policy for Senator Jeff Merkley. Matt has led the housing team in Senator Merkley's office for the past 7 years, and his particular areas of interest include rural housing preservation through USDA's appropriations account. So lots of good thoughts there that relate here. Also manufactured housing preservation and financing and fair market rent reform. I also want to introduce Michael Hernandez. He is the Vice President of Engagement and Impact at Fannie Mae. Among other responsibilities, Mike oversees the design, implementation, and reporting of the Duty to Serve plan for Fannie Mae, which aligns very closely with the conversation we are having today related to rural housing and to housing preservation. So Lance and George are also here with us. I've introduced them previously and will be available to also field some of these questions for the panel. As questions come up that you might have for the panel, please send those via Q&A or chat as you have been. But I'm going to start with some targeted questions toward Matt at Senator Merkley's office. Matt, because seeing that Senator Merkley is the chair of appropriations, I was wondering if you could speak directly to the role that appropriations can play in the preservation of affordable housing and how this relates to the preservation of our rural housing stock.
Sure. Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Enterprise, and everyone for gathering today. We're not quite chairman yet, but we're hopefully getting there. Just to point of clarification, Senator Merkley is on the committee, and we try to be quite active, particularly in the rural housing space. We served for Senator Merkley served for several years as a top Democrat on the Ag Appropriation Subcommittee. So, I mean, through that process, obviously every year there's always kind of push for more funding generally. But, we were also able to create, for example, the Technical Assistance Program to expedite and to hopefully smooth transfers, particularly to nonprofits and public and PHAs. So, I think that the goal there is to obviously bring knowledge, bring a little bit more emphasis on helping people and organizations that are, need some help, basically understanding the process, guiding through it. I think another role that we're just sort of developing currently, and we're working closely with Senator Wyden's office on this, is just the new congressionally directed spending process, which frankly, we're still learning and figuring out as we go. But we'd love to continue to work on that and work with you all to see how that can be a really effective kind of targeted tool. We continue to anticipate that funding won't be, certainly won't replace or will, act on its own to preserve, but we think it could be an effective kind of piece of that puzzle. And so we'll look forward to working on that.
Fantastic, thank you. And if any others of you have thoughts on how appropriations corresponds with rural housing preservation, please let me know. Madison, I was hoping you could tell us more about how the DASH Act specifically is going to impact rural housing, should it be passed in its current form, how it can impact rural housing preservation of affordable stock.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robin. And I want to echo Matt in saying thank you, for putting this together and for inviting me to be here. So Senator Wyden's Decent, Affordable, Safe Housing for All Act would permanently reauthorize the Multifamily Preservation and Rehabilitation Program at USDA. So that would restructure existing 515 loans and incentivize property owners to maintain affordability and maintain protections for existing tenants. It would also provide properties with capital resources to do the repair and restoration. We know that, folks living in rural affordable housing often have worse, physical housing available to them than people in more urban areas. So it would provide properties with those capital resources, but also ensure that all residents have access to rental assistance, as it would require USDA to offer rental assistance to any tenant when their landlords or the housing provider, property owner, when their mortgage reaches maturity or they decide to exit the program otherwise. So providing that rental assistance and ensuring that homes are repaired and restored kind of has a 1-2 punch of making sure that the stock of affordable housing remains strong and that tenants are still able to afford the roof over their head. And it would fund an additional $250 million a year in that increased rental assistance for low-income folks in rural areas. So it's new construction, preservation, and rental assistance, kind of all in one.
Fantastic. And I think really key, especially as we were talking about the rental assistance and the way that right now USDA programs are sort of aligned with the coupling and decoupling. I think we'll be hearing a lot of this language in the next several months as some of this gets worked out through legislation. So it's good to be in conversation with you here as we're having this conversation with Dan and with agencies to to fully understand, and then those of us who are working in the field on these projects day to day, so that we can understand what tools are going to be available to help us support residents in rural communities at the end of the day. So given that, Mike, we've had a question that came in. It says it's directed to Dan, but I'm going to direct it first to you and then get Dan's answer. The question is, how is a partnership with Fannie? The question is Fannie and Freddie, but I'll direct it to you for Fannie since you're at Fannie. How is that partnership going with working together to preserve the 515 housing stock as it is kind of explicitly understood under the duty to serve?
Yeah, thank you, Robin, and thanks to everybody in Enterprise for facilitating this and all the great work you've done, not only this year, for decades in this space and across the country, and to my panelists for your enthusiasm and hard work to find more investment dollars and strategies to really bring more capital to rural America. A couple ways to answer the question. The direct way is we're making great progress. This past year, we spent a lot of time, and as I think you heard Dan, there are a lot of, and as most of the listeners know, there's a lot of nuances to the USDA products. There's a lot of nuances to the conventional products. And so one of the things that we started on about a year ago was to figure out how could we marry up our private sector capital in ways that could help leverage, in particular, the 515 program. And this year we spent the time, Dan, working with your team to essentially create an ability to have a side-by-side, well, actually an ability to bring private capital in with 515 debt in a subordinated structure. It took us a while to work through all the lawyers and the business elements to be able to structure that. But we think that's going to set the stage for our ability to be able to attract private sector developers and lenders into this space in a way that will stretch the dollars that are available there. I mean, part of the challenge is, and so we haven't closed our first 515 loan under that product, but we've got the framework in place, and we've done extensive work this year with all our lenders. We operate through what we call a delegated and underwriting servicing model on the multifamily side. We've got a team of 27 lenders that are out there, many of them who are active in the rural space. And so those lenders, we've been helping them to understand and get better educated on the 515 product and our ability to be able to invest in this space. And we've had a lot of success previously. We've since 2018, our first duty to serve plan, we've invested over 15,000 units of high needs rural regions. And the other place that we've looked at is not only to bringing debt, but how do we bring equity to that market? Because the number that stuck out for me that Lance reminded me of was the median income of the families that live in many of these 515 properties, at 13,000 or 11,000, however you cut it. That makes it difficult to reposition these properties, especially if they have significant capital needs over all this period. And so the ability to bring equity dollars, subsidy dollars, and private capital is really, I think, going to be part of the longer term solution. Where we need to get better, and I look forward to working even closer with Dan and his team, is understanding where are the best opportunities, where can we move that now, how do we set up a pipeline that we've gone through to better understand which units are best positioned for the resources that we have, and how quickly can we move those to take full advantage of the dollars that are out there. I think some of the changes that that Dan was talking about is as it relates to the am I trying to think of as the ability to be able to get tax credit dollars out there as quickly as possible and know that you're going to be able to meet the timelines. That's critical for many of our borrowers and lenders. And so, and then you asked earlier about subsidy. I can't lobby as a member of Fannie Mae, But I can tell you, having the ability to leverage the subsidy, we've seen it in expiring use tax credit programs across the country. That's huge. And being able to combine that with state and local fundings, we've had tremendous success in that space as well. So more to come, but I think we're on the right trajectory. And, this coming year is going to be very impactful.
Thanks. And I think we've had a few questions that have come through Q&A and through the chat that I would love to kind of get some insight on as they relate to prepayment and how prepayment is kind of looked at in the data. And also, I think, so Lance, maybe if you can help me answer that question. And then I think a follow-on question would be to that, are there ways for us to know if projects have been prepaid, if they actually still have affordable housing restrictions or not?
Thanks, Robin. And I might also ask Dan to weigh in on this as well. But I would say from the data perspective, and that's where that is the minor perspective here. We do try to track, and we have from time to time, and you'll look in the prior, the 2017 report, how many properties exited and the disposition for the exit. So there are, and Dan can elaborate on this in greater detail, when you have the ability to prepay, which Mike introduced the term about nuance in this program. There are a lot of nuances in the prepayment elements. So I'm not going to go into detail, but there are some restrictive use provisions or a similar terminology that are placed on some of the properties that prepay. And we think we have some ability to identify that. So that does, I wouldn't say that it muddles the picture somewhat, but it makes it less, black and white. It is a little more nuanced, candidly. At this point, though, when we were doing the update for these numbers, we simply don't have confidence. And I don't mean to sound like a broken record. We just don't have confidence where we want to place the reason for disposition or the disposition for exit. We have some conflicting numbers that we just cannot reconcile. So I'm sorry that I can't give you more information other than, yes, we do have the ability to somewhat track prepayments, but sometimes we're having difficulty reconciling those with the properties that exited, and we just need to do more work on that for lack of a better excuse. So thanks, and I would turn the harder part of that question over to Dan.
Yeah, and thanks, Lance, and I wish I had a better answer. So like the merits of the data certainly aren't lost on us, right? The challenges that we're facing right now through this realignment is, collecting the data that was sort of, shotgun sprayed out there, and dealing with our own internal infrastructure issues. Some of our systems don't track things as simple as consolidations, for example. So we can't mine right now from our data warehouses the data that we would need to identify and provide a full comprehensive list of assets that were part of a prepayment and have, a use restriction in place. It's critical that we have that, and I'm working to try to identify ways to be able to get it. So it's two steps. It's getting the data and then making it available to folks, which is something that we're really interested in doing. So we've made a lot of strides with being transparent about, what's in our portfolio, what's, the awards that I'm making and making sure that folks are really aware of what's out there. But we have a lot of work to do there, and it is a priority of ours. The other reason is not just for the purpose of data reporting, but there's some mission delivery and some credit and mission risk lessons to be learned there too. Going back and identifying what those contributing factors were, whether it was a financial default or a technical default, and then setting up ways to mitigate those and prevent them from happening in the future is a really valuable lesson learned. But it starts, like Lance said, with having the data. So something we're actively working on and really interested in getting into it. I'm a pretty data-driven person. I like that. I like using forecasting when it comes to predictability. I like using it to identify attributes that we can mitigate against in the future. So these are all things that we're really going to be taking a close look at in the coming months. good question, and I'm looking forward to having a much better answer. I feel a little lost operating without it, but it's something that we'll get there.
Right. And really, Lance, please do not apologize. We're just so happy that some of this data is collected in a way that we're able to see it and understand it and sort of see what is coming to us. So knowing that we have to continue to massage it a bit to fully understand all of the different intricacies is just part of the puzzle. So really, again, just very thankful that we have this set of data and the original report to look back at and draw from as we think about solutions. Building on kind of that thought, it's been pointed out, the rural housing stock is old, right? I think all of it's about 20 years old. Much of it is, over 30 years old. And much of it needs a lot of rehab. So a re-am or a re-amortization alone or a refinance alone is not going to ensure long-term, decent, safe, affordable housing, right, for the future. So thinking about that, I know that we've talked about a permanent source for NPR, but given that NPR right now is fully expended, what are the steps to ensure that we have additional dollars to get this necessary rehab done, to not only preserve the portfolio in loan term, but to preserve the portfolio in a way that is most tenable to our vulnerable residents? That's for everyone. Anyone who wants to jump in can jump in with that answer.
Well, can I just say first that it's a great question. One of the mechanisms that we have, so from our perspective and internally, to the extent that USDA can help, it depends on the resources that are made available to us. Absent those resources, what we're left are with really creative ways to try to figure out how we can repurpose, operating income to addressing those capital repairs. And one of the mechanisms that we have is that debt deferral, MPR, being able to take any existing debt, the associated payments that are allocated to that debt, defer the debt, and then repurpose those payments to either capitalizing reserves or leveraging, making the repairs directly, or leveraging capital to pay for those repairs. Is a viable pathway. It's not for everybody. It wouldn't solve a lot of the problems that we're talking about, but it's one of the resources. But it all brings me back to how I started this conversation, which is what we're really dependent on is having those internal resources, either as part of the annual appropriation, which we expect, and the ARP legislation, which like Michael, I'm not permitted to lobby. I can communicate to you the need. I can tell you what's out there, and that's as far as I can go in the conversation. But that's a critical resource that would really go a long way toward addressing what's imminent in that 515 portfolio through year 2029.
Yeah, and Dan, I would add to that. I think that's absolutely right. While not for every asset, but again, we found that tax credit equity, it continues to be one of the best tools to bring that needed capital at a capital cost and part of that stack to be able to preserve those properties. Doesn't work for all of them, depending on the income and asset value and obviously the allocation. And I applaud your work with the housing finance agencies to help them, even better prioritize some of these opportunities that are out there. Because I know we see that, like I said, in the preservation side of the business, leveraging Section 8 dollars where they're available. The other thing, I guess I hadn't focused enough on the decoupling aspect, and I realize it's an idea still that's out there, but that makes a lot of sense to me as well as a way to be able to leverage and capture current market rents to be able to take that value and put it back into the property, not only to meet the current needs, but to meet the longer term needs of that asset for the remaining of its life. I think those are going to be some of the ways that we're going to be able to do it, because it's not going to be easy. You've just got a mathematical equation that makes it very difficult unless there's subsidy or unless there's equity. And the only other thing that comes to mind, Robin, for me is that We've also started to work over the last couple of years more aggressively with CDFIs. And many times CDFIs have access to capital that can also go into these developments. We've done transactions on tribal lands and in colonias or around colonias, and they've been tremendously helpful in moving that solution. So I would add the whole category of CDFIs to the potential opportunity for all of us as not only additional partners, but maybe even other sources of equity that can help leverage, help solve these capital needs for 515 properties.
Madison.
Yeah, I would love to just go off of Michael. You raised, the importance of tax credit equity, and as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Wyden is dedicated right now to expanding the pool of LIHTC, and he's also proposed a middle-income housing tax credit. In recognition that there just isn't enough, there aren't enough resources, nationwide to do this necessary preservation and rehabilitation, let alone new development. So in his DASH Act, there's a 50% expansion of the 9% credit. And this past December, Senator Wyden was able to secure that 4% floor for the 4% credit, which is, we know already has made a difference for properties in Oregon and nationwide. And the middle income housing tax credit, I noted someone asked a question about that gap of folks in moderate income. So the middle income housing tax credit is something that would address that missing middle. And that expansion to LIHTC is something that Senator Wyden is pushing really hard for in the Build Back Better agenda. Obviously, all of that is very up in the air right now, but Senate Democrats as a whole are committed to expanding the low-income housing tax credit and investing further in housing generally too.
Thanks for that. And Matt and Lance, did either of you have something you wanted to weigh in on that question? Matt's just smiling. That's good. Again, it comes down a lot of times to the dollars and the dollars being available to do the work. And I think this is part of what I know that the senators are working on, and that we're, collectively know is needed right in the field. So one question came up through chat, and then I think got raised again in Q&A, is how can USDA work to support resident services as part of its underwriting process, or in like above the line as I look at projects in a pro forma? Is that something that's being considered at the USDA level, like it has been allowed to do on a HUD 202 project, for example? Dan.
Yeah, really good question. It's something that's been raised recently. We don't have an answer for you yet, but let me just say philosophically, it's something that I support. The task that I have ahead of me is finding out what the regulatory and, if any, statutory barriers are in place there. What we're seeing a lot, frankly, and what we saw quite a bit of during our last Farm Labor Housing round, was that, as is expected in some of the higher cost markets, there are a lot of sources that are being paired with our resources. Some that you would, some come with conditions that I believe are either state or locally driven, required to house certain populations that require those services in place to sustain their housing. So the merits of it certainly aren't lost on us. It's just figuring out how to get there. In the model that I was talking about earlier, if it's successful, this isn't 514 Farm Labor Housing Associated. This is specifically 515. When I was talking about our advocacy to decouple that rental assistance, shifting that rent setting from an operating budget that might have restrictions in there to a market, a market rent-based rent setting, removes that from the equation. It really puts properties in a position to determine how they're going to spend their operating income. So if we're unable to successfully advocate for it in the budget based space, then there would be potential for it in that market rent setting space if we were successful there. But it's important. I support it. It's just figuring out a way to get there.
Thanks, Dan. I think that would be really important, particularly as we've highlighted the highly vulnerable population that is housed in USDA 515 housing stock. I also want to call attention, Mike had mentioned CDFIs as being important in this process, and for the funding, Rob Prash, who is from NOAA in Oregon, has just put in a little bit of the chat about how part of the way to get third-party financing in is just to make sure we're removing as many barriers as possible to make refinance and that layered financing, which is so important, I think, really for all of these deals, but also that layered fund with each layer, we have another set of compliance and due dates. And so I am appreciative of RD thinking about, at least in terms even of just calendars, as we're working to make sure that those all align. So with that, I think we are going to wrap up the panel. I really want to extend appreciation to all of our panelists, Dan, Madison, Matt, Michael, and Lance, for your expertise that you've lent to us today on this panel, for the work that you are doing to support our rural communities, and to the thought that you've put behind rural communities. We need to have advocates who are raising up the issue of affordable housing being a problem in rural communities in addition to in metro communities. So very appreciative of your work in that space and for being here today. I also want to make sure I thank my colleagues who've been working on the back end of this webinar, Adrienne Norwood, and also Susan Anderson. Adrienne has been supporting, you heard her name invoked a couple of times as we advance slides, and I want to make sure that I recognize her as putting in the work to make this event possible. We do have some upcoming events that might be of interest to those of you who are participating on the call. On October 26th, via Enterprise's Facebook page, we will be streaming a webinar on environmental justice and through the lens of our Native stewards. That'll be hosted as part of our Native American programming, and I think we're going to have some amazing speakers, including Dallas Goldstooth, who has been doing a lot of this work for a long time. So something to look out for. And I'm also going to be sharing the recording of all registrants will get a recording of this webinar and of the slides that have been submitted to us and were shared with you as part of the webinar process. So with that, again, gratitude to not only our panelists, but to those of you who have been here and listened to the questions that have been presented. I'm sorry if we did not get to all of the questions. We did our best to sort of thematically group questions as they came along. But should anyone have questions about this webinar or want to get in touch with any of the panelists, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. My email is robinwolf@enterprisecommunity.org, and I am open to trying to get the right resources to you as you work to navigate challenges in your community and want to support affordable housing in your community. And so with that, I will say goodbye. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you again.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, everybody.